All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight for Heritage Hour. Our topic tonight is For Posterity's Eyes Only. We're going to be looking at diaries, letters, and correspondence. So a bit of a interesting topic tonight. Hopefully we can dig up some dirt and see what people were writing about 100 years or 150 years ago. My name is Dana Thorne. I'm going to be moderating tonight, and I'm the Curator Supervisor at Lambton Heritage Museum. And I'm joined by heritage professionals from across Lambton County that are all part of the Heritage Sarnia Lambton Museum Network. We've been doing these Heritage Hours since the beginning of the pandemic, so it's been a great way to come together from different parts of Lambton County and share on some interesting topics. If you want to see any of the other topics that we've covered previously, you can go to heritagelambton.ca and see the video recordings from our previous talks. And we'll also be posting the video from this talk, and we'll be sending it over email to anyone who is registered. So if you thought it was really interesting and you want to share it with any of your friends and family, it will be available for that. So tonight, like I said, we're looking at diaries, letters, and correspondence. From what I've read from these kind of documents, sometimes they can be really mundane and people are just recording the weather, but sometimes you can get really, really neat insight into people's lives. And I think that's what we're going to hear from our presenters tonight. I'm technically just moderating and not presenting, but I couldn't resist sharing a few highlights from one of my favorite diaries, and I'll try to sprinkle in a few between the presenters, as long as we're not going over time. So this is the diary of Samuel Smith, who is a War of 1812 veteran and one of the earliest surveyors in Lambton County. While he was tromping through the woods and laying out the lots and concessions for 4 of Lambton's townships, he kept a diary. And sometimes he was recording about how challenging his job was and the progress they were making in their survey work, but he also recorded his dreams, which I think is pretty fascinating to hear about these dreams from the late 1820s, early 1830s. So on July 21st, he wrote, "I dreamt that my father had built a very large 7-story stone house. I suppose such a house would cost 15,000 pounds. He built it on my farm to spite me, and he said that I should not have a farthing of his property. I went in and took something to eat. I saw the masons working at the house, the work the most complicated that I had ever saw." There's your first dream from Samuel Smith tonight. Our first speaker is going to be Erin D. Richard. She is the Curator Supervisor for the Oil Museum of Canada. She's worked in museums in Canada and England, including the Guelph Museum, the Brant Historical Society, and the Royal Collections at Windsor, the British Postal Museum, and Black Creek Pioneer Village. Erin holds a Master of Museum Studies from the University of Leicester and a BA Honors in History from the University of Guelph. So thank you for being here tonight, Erin.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. And have to open my presentation. There we go. All right. Hello. So the diary I'm sharing tonight is actually a prized possession of museums. It's written by Edward Winnett, or Winnett, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but he was an international oil driller who kept a diary for the duration of his contract abroad. The diary starts at the beginning of his journey from Petrolia to Sumatra on October 7th, 1897. And he stopped writing on October 5th, 1899 on his return home journey a week before he reached Vancouver. Edward was born in 1849 in Ireland, and he came to Canada with his family when he was just 6 years old. They arrived in 1855 and settled in London, Ontario. Edward eventually began working in his father's boiler shop, and he soon married Annie in 1873. They moved to Oil Springs 10 years later, and he managed a boiler shop in the village of Oil Springs that had been set up by his father. Annie and Edward had 11 children, 6 of whom lived beyond childhood, but such a large family might have been the reason, or what had persuaded Edward to take up the contract to work abroad at the age of 48, as international drillers were known to make excellent money. Edward left Petrolia and headed for Sumatra in 1897 with a contract with the Royal Dutch Company. As a boilermaker, he was to help set up and operate a large refinery in the region. Today, Sumatra is part of Indonesia, but in the 1890s, it was part of the Dutch colonies known as the Dutch East Indies. His journey took 2 months and 7 days to arrive at his new home at the refinery, 8 kilometers from the town of Palembang in Sumatra. The trip required 2 trains, 2 steamships, a rowboat, and many ports of call. On October 7th, he wrote in his diary, "We were met at the station in Petrolia by hundreds of my old acquaintances and friends to bid goodbye to myself and party." Despite the celebration, Edward found the parting from his family a difficult one. Throughout his diary, he continually touches on his loneliness for his wife and kids and how much he misses being home. And on this slide at the top, you can actually see he uses the old spelling of Petrolia with an EA at the end. And the first steamship of his journey was the SS Labrador. This ship was reportedly the finest four-mast steamship of its day. Unfortunately, it was a rough journey for most passengers as they met a storm with heavy winds once they reached the Atlantic from Montreal. He wrote, "There is a neighborhood of 200 passengers seasick. The sea is rolling mountain high, coming clean over the hurricane deck. I don't feel very well myself, but can have a good laugh at the others. I expect they will have a laugh at me tomorrow." The next day, however, he still seemed to be fine and wrote, "I am in good health, and after eating a good breakfast, the sea is still raging and a good many are sick." He would prove to have an iron stomach during his journey to Sumatra, as he never once experienced seasickness while at sea. They landed in Liverpool and took a train to London, and he seemed to be enamored with that city, amazed by the dense population and beautiful architecture, parks, and churches. He wrote, "It is something I cannot describe. Just think of a city with a population of 6 million people. The streets are one living mass of people. Also, the streets blocked at times. It is impossible for one to move." And I was reminded while reading his diary that history isn't linear when he writes about taking an 8-mile walk to Whitechapel to see the place where the serial killer Jack the Ripper 5 years earlier had killed his apparent last victim. Historically, along with many parts of East London, Whitechapel had a reputation for severe poverty, overcrowding, and the social problems that come along with it. And Edward described Whitechapel as a horrible place. The next steamship Edward takes, he names the Prince Hendrik and describes it as a floating palace. It lands in Port Said in Egypt. 7 weeks into his journey, Edward is finally experiencing culture shock. As he ventures ashore, he commented that, "Of all the sights I have saw yet, and there was to be seen, sights never to be forgotten, there seems to be no civilization." As Gary May describes in his book Hard Oiler, Edward clung to the friendly, familiar things, wielding them like a shield against the diversity he was experiencing for the first time in his life. Edward finally arrives at his destination on October 14th, 1897, and he describes his bungalow. It is a building of about 30 feet long and 25 feet wide with 4 large rooms, also a hall and kitchen, and a large veranda on front and back. It is situated within 5 feet of the river and surrounded with the most beautiful fruit trees as coconut and banana and pineapples and other fruit I do not know the name of. I am well pleased with my bungalow, also the location. The river museum is very large, about the size of the St. Clair River at Sarnia, and a continual stream of small boats passing up and down both day and night, and also steamers. Every day they bring mail to Palembang. Edward recounts his routine of heading to Palembang for supplies for construction of the refinery. And due to Edward's experience with boiler shops, he was put in charge of a large crew to build oil tanks capable of holding 20,000 barrels, a railroad connecting the tanks to the nearby river, and a 200-kilometer pipeline linking the oil fields to the coast, which he writes will be the longest pipeline in the world. And he also boasts, "I can say what no one else can. I was the first to do a piece of boiler work on the island of Sumatra." He notes the dangers that surround him with the wild animals, pitch black darkness at night, and sometimes hostile workforce. Another danger was disease, and Edward fell ill with yellow fever in March. He eventually is taken to the hospital in Palembang, where he stays recovering for the next 4 months, but he doesn't write in his diary. Finally, the loneliness and homesickness get to Edward, and a year after arriving, almost to the day, Edward prepares for his journey back to Canada and his family. Some of his last entries are about crossing the international date line and finally succumbing to seasickness. I have not wrote much in my diary for the last few days as I have been very seasick. The first seasickness I have had since I left home. The sea is rolling mountain high and our noble ship is doing well, making 350 miles every 25 hours. On his return, Edward and his family moved to Sarnia, then Port Huron, Michigan, where he lived until his death in 1917 at the age of 68. So this diary is an invaluable historical account of the day-to-day life of an international driller in Sumatra in the 1890s. However, it also reveals the Victorian colonial sensibilities through the language he uses and the perception of his surroundings. This white Presbyterian man is often scandalized and pearl clutching when he sees the local immodest clothing and witnesses the burial rituals of different cultural groups. And a good amount of my research came from this book, Heart Oiler by Gary May. And in it, he does have a good recounting of the diary in one of the chapters. We do have it for sale in our gift shop if you're interested. And if you want to read more about the international drillers or learn about oil pioneers of Lambton County. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Erin. I think I would have been one of the 200 passengers that was seasick, and Edward would have been laughing at me. That sounds horrible. Our next speaker is Fiona Doherty. She is the museum coordinator at Moore Museum, where she has worked since 2018. Fiona was born and raised in Point Edward and attended Western University, studying anthropology and geography. She worked as an archaeological field technician in southwestern Ontario for several years. She completed museum studies at Algonquin College and did her internship at the National Museum of Ireland. Thank you for being here tonight, Fiona.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to apologize right off the bat. My camera is not working right now, but I will go ahead and share my screen and get started. So my name is Fiona and I am the museum coordinator at Moore Museum. So diaries, a valuable window for looking into the past. They provide us with a variety of information, from a glimpse into the daily lives and customs of our ancestors to firsthand accounts of historical events. And perhaps most importantly, they provide us with a human dimension to sometimes dry historical facts. There are a few diaries in the collection at Moore Museum, but as it happens, when this topic came about, one of our volunteers had mentioned that he was reading his mother's diaries. During our lunch hours, he'd been sharing some anecdotes from these diaries, and so I asked if he would be open to sharing them with you all as well. So today, I'm going to talk about some entries from the diaries of the mother of one of our dedicated volunteers. He's also a member of the Moore Museum Advisory Committee and Heritage St. Clair and a lifelong resident of St. Clair Township, and his name is Mr. Dave Pattenden. So as you can see here, in a branch of the tree of the family tree of the Pattendens currently living in St. Clair Township. Their ancestry can be traced back a few generations to the Combs family from England. This section of the family tree came from Maiden Newton, England. Maiden Newton is a village and civil parish in the county of Dorset, just north of Dorchester. And as I mentioned, these passages we have are from the diaries of Dave's mother, Dorothy Laura Moon. So Dorothy is pictured here as a baby with her mother Anne and grandparents Robert Gibbs Stewart and Laura Adele Stockdale. She kept a diary starting in 1944 until the mid-1980s. One of the first things that Dave remarked on when sharing these passages with me was that he didn't expect to see the descriptive entries that his mother wrote, and that in his words, he had learned more about mother's life, a feel for her times, quite differently than I'd thought before reading them. This is one of the things that I find intriguing about diaries as a historical source. Personal text has a certain open and candid quality in comparison to fact-driven references. Isaac Disraeli wrote in the 1817 Curiosities of Literature, "We converse with the absent by letters and with ourselves by diaries." And this is perhaps the reason we find an honesty in these entries that otherwise might not have been shared. The descriptive entries from Dorothy paint quite a picture in your head. For example, on January 30th in 1944, while staying at her grandmother's house on the St. Clair River, Dorothy wrote, "The river looks a ribbon of gray satin, dark sheets of gray towards the American shore, and delicate pearl gray along the Canadian banks. The south wind ripples a shimmering wave. Gorgeous, beautiful. These photos are from Moore's collection and were taken of the St. Clair River in the early to mid 1900s when they want to start showing up. Given that color photography wasn't widely available in the 1940s, these entries give another level of depth and meaning to these historical photos. Later that same year, Dorothy wrote, "Today is very spring-like. The sunset is magnificent, the river is very still, and the images of the trees on the American shore are reflected in the water. Shore ice extends perhaps 10 yards from the bank, and some strange cakes are floating slowly along. To the north, the water is a pale gray pink, but to the south, it is a deep apricot color. Above are the fluffy mulberry clouds. A little distant is a mauve and dark purple one. Beautiful." Another thing that Dave remarked on that also caught my attention while looking through the museum's collection was how world events and daily events were represented side by side by the writers of these diaries. In our collection at the museum, we have a diary that was written between 1922 and 1966. And although we know the donor of this artifact, the only thing we know about the author is that they were an employee of Imperial Oil. Often in these writings, we see mention of global events, those which are still acknowledged and studied around the world, set beside those of daily life in the experience of the author. Here, there's mention of the Labatt kidnapping in 1934, and it's sandwiched in between recordings of some drinks at a local hotel and a local street party. And another in the same diary, the author mentions the retirement of a coworker between visits from royalty, the breakout of war, and even the fall of a meteor. Similarly, Dorothy acknowledges some major world events in her writings beside those that happened locally within her household. In this example, she talks about the assassination of Robert Kennedy, but remarks that it was still a lovely day in the end. In Dave's words, what he found interesting is a world event takes place, then mixed with everyday activities, life goes on regardless of big or small events. I personally enjoy how they're written side by side, sort of on level ground and of equal importance, because it reflects the reality of the experience for the author. Yes, in June of 1968, a major historical event took place, the assassination of a world leader, but at the same time, the portrait was not going to paint itself. These types of entries appeal to family and friends of the author, but also the public, as they offer an unfiltered account of historical events. They express the good and the bad, the significant and the mundane, the ups and the downs. As we can see in a further example from Dorothy, these were uncensored versions of events. These accounts provide insights into the lives of ordinary people, marginalized groups, or individuals whose voices may have been overlooked in traditional historical narratives. Perhaps most importantly, though, through this uncensored conversation with oneself, they can humanize the past and create a more nuanced understanding of history. Overall, I'll say that I really did enjoy doing research for this topic. It gave me a larger appreciation of diaries as a historical resource and understanding of their value as primary, diverse, and unfiltered accounts of history. I'm really looking forward to reading more of what's in the museum's collection, and I encourage anyone who has something like this at home to reach out to your local museum or archives and see if they'd be interested in preserving it for you. And with that said, I will hand things back to Dana. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Fiona. I loved her descriptions of the St. Clair River. Very poetic, very beautiful. I'm going to do another dream from Samuel Smith. So this is August 8th, 1828. I dreamed I was at the celebration of the town of Guelph. There's a great collection of people with very fine coaches with 6 horses driving up and down through the streets of Guelph. I saw Mr. Galt in his coach and 6 horses, without a hat, but had a handkerchief in his head. He drove his horses himself. I saw one carriage broke down. It was full of ladies, but as no one was hurt, I saw it appeared to me as if it was they who had the best horses. I wish I could remember my dreams as well as he remembers his. Next up is going to be Professor Greg Stott. Greg is currently the Associate Professor at University College of the North in Thompson, Manitoba. He grew up in Arkona and completed his undergraduate and master's degrees in history at the University of Western Ontario and his PhD in history at McMaster. He's published works in various scholarly journals and published local histories and family histories. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. Can everyone see the screen? All right. This is actually based on an article that I had published. It was published in 2006, so it's not particularly original research, but it relates to a series of two caches of family correspondence from the Dunham family who were centered on Lambton County. One collection was in Victoria, and another collection belonged to my maternal grandfather, and this who was a member of the Dunham family. This is a very brief, simplified family tree. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I'm focusing my attentions in this article and this presentation essentially on the children, this married couple, Elijah Dunham and Anna Mariah Briggs, and their 8 children. So that's a very quick, simplified family tree. I once told my students that I loved reading people's diaries and letters, and I think they thought I was a bit creepy. I had to clarify that people who had long since been deceased and so forth and left their letters and so forth for posterity. Individually, often these letters are not terribly remarkable, and Dana, you alluded to that. But when you take them as a collection and a whole, you begin to paint pictures and see relationships and so on. And they're quite fascinating, and we can get a good insight into what these people felt and how they felt about each other and their relationships. These are the parents, photographs of the parents taken in the 1870s. They came from East Gwillimbury Township in York County, north of Toronto. They were married in 1832. Elijah was remembered for loving his one son. Charitably wrote that he loved to entertain the Wesleyan Methodist clergy. Another son apparently caustically said that was the only quality his father had. He was not very good as an economic manager, and they moved to the Queen's Bush in Wellington County in 1848, but suffered serious economic reverses. And ultimately, in the 1860s, the couple left the province, moved to Iowa, essentially to escape their creditors, and their second son was left to essentially sell off the property. Elijah wrote a number of letters that have survived. He was very often concerned, interestingly enough, about the spiritual concerns of his children. He was often concerned about their welfare and so forth as well. Anna Mariah, unfortunately, I don't know whether she was able to write or not. We have no surviving correspondence from her, but she was frequently referenced in the letters of her husband and her youngest daughter. So she would certainly, it would say something, mother asked to be remembered, or mother is sending you this, that, and the other thing. So we get a sense that she would, and there's a sense in the correspondence that the children had much more respect for their mother than they possibly did for their father. And so on. And one of the letters, one of the brothers, Jonathan, wrote to his brother, thanking him for having persuaded him to have left the family home, because it seemed that the father was relying on his economic contributions far too much, and so on. There are 2 children who do not factor or did not leave correspondence behind, and it's mostly because they died very young. The eldest child, Elizabeth Ann, was married and had 3 children, but sadly, as you can see, she died in her late 20s. There are no surviving letters from her. She was occasionally referenced in retrospect in some of the surviving correspondence, the last time in 1917 on the anniversary of her death. And so she was certainly never forgotten by her siblings, but we have no correspondence from her. Her younger brother, Walter Gage Dunham, died sadly of scarlet fever when he was only 14. And this is a bookmark that presumably his mother had made for him, and it was found inside the family Bible. So unfortunately, these 2 people never really emerge as personalities in the way that their other siblings do. The second child, Thomas, and he was referred to as Tommy, he had a tempestuous relationship with his father. He stormed off from the family farm before they moved to, the family had only arrived in Lambton in the early 1870s. Tommy had long before left the family, apparently had an argument with his father over breaking an axe, stormed off, and never came home. He ran away to sea and had ambitions of becoming a sea captain. There are only 2 surviving letters from him from 1862 and 1866, and he notably wrote to his brother and asked to be remembered to my mother, my sisters, and my brothers. He pointedly does not mention his father, which suggests there was some tensions there. Unfortunately, the letters stopped. And the family tried for decades to find out what had happened to Tommy. The assumption was that he was lost at sea. He was married. There's a portrait, a photographic portrait of his wife taken in New Orleans. Unfortunately, no name was ascribed to that, and no one knows what happened, but they were clearly haunted by his loss. I call Robert the dutiful son. He followed his parents ultimately to Lambton County. They settled in Watford. He settled in Arkona. And he is going to be one of the preservers of a large portion of the family correspondence. He was the father of 11 children. He was dutiful. He constantly was going to visit his parents. He was supplying them with food and so on. He would help do work around the house and so on. His brother Billy would complain that he wasn't contributing enough financially, but his sister Martha, the youngest, who I will get to, defended Robert and said he might not provide much in the way of financial benefits, but he certainly does so in kind. While his rest of his siblings sort of moved on and fanned out across the continent, Robert was sort of stayed close by the family, his parents. He did have a wild, at one point in 1897, he announced to the community he was leaving for the Klondike, but apparently his family persuaded him to stay. So his last gasp at adventure was ultimately foiled. Billy, or Willie, interestingly enough, the Dunhams were loyalists, but they named their son after the American president and general William Henry Harrison. I don't understand why. He was known as Billy. He had a tempestuous relationship. The letters suggest he was critical of many of his siblings, and he's referred to critically by his youngest sister in particular. He was a carpenter and a farmer. He engaged in business and ultimately moved to Manitoba in the 1870s. Later in life, he seems to have tried to patch things up. He was delighted to get letters from his youngest sister, and she was amazed by this. Curiously, before he moved, he wrote to a younger brother who had already moved there, and he wanted to know the lay of the land, and he wanted to know which towns in Manitoba were Grit and which towns were Tory, because he did not want to end up in a Tory town, which suggests something about his politics. Now, Jonathan was known, and the siblings referred to each other by their nicknames as Jaunty. Jaunty became a trained teacher. He went to the Ottawa Normal School, and he traveled to various postings across Ontario, teaching in various positions. He ultimately married one of his former students, which is maybe problematic. He ultimately attempted business, failed miserably, and ended up moving to Orillia, where he was engaged in the insurance business. And he would remain an insurance salesman up until he died in 1925. He frequently wrote and asked his siblings to invest money. He was trying to get them to invest and so on, beseeching them to come and visit him. And it got to the point where apparently, and this is a family tradition, he would send self-addressed stamped envelopes in his correspondence, basically saying, you better write back. Here's an incentive. You don't have to fork out money for the stamp, and so on. And his letters are poignant. He loses a son in the First World War. And one of the last letters I have for him describes the lament and the tragedy of that terrible loss. Wilmot, he was John Wilmot, but he was known to the family by his middle name. He remained at home longest with his parents until his brother wrote to him, and Robert said, you need to leave. They'll depend on you till your dying day otherwise. So he left. He ended up going to Dakota Territory. Unfortunately, his first wife and young daughter died there. He faced legal and financial crises. He remarried and ultimately moved to Manitoba. I think he moved to Manitoba to escape legal problems in the United States. There's a letter that I discovered afterward. His second wife wrote to him from Plumas, Manitoba. He'd gone to Winnipeg to work as a carpenter. She was writing in December, describing the temperature in the house as below freezing. The children were wearing all of their clothing. The stove was glowing red. The neighbor's wife had gone insane. And she said, send us the train fare. We're joining you in the city. If you don't send us the train fare, we're still coming. But and I presume that he ultimately did so. Sadly, he survived 3 of his 5 children, but he also preserved family correspondence. So the second collection was bequeathed to his granddaughter in Victoria. He was also a family historian, and he and his brother Robert corresponded in 1905, trying to collect the family history and the dates and stories and so forth. Now, the youngest child was Martha. She was the youngest daughter. She had a teaching certificate. She briefly did leave Watford to teach. She worked and lived for a few months in London. Otherwise, she became sort of the family drudge, unfortunately. As many young daughters, the youngest daughters, she was left, probably with no choice, to take care of her elderly parents. Her letters are often full of begging, calling for money, asking her brothers for money, complaining about her brothers who didn't contribute, complaining about the tight times at home. She sometimes vented about her parents and so on. And one poignant passage after her father passed away, she said, "We miss Pa so much, fixing things up, but he's happier. Sometimes, and so our friends come to town to see us. Milton Taylor came Monday on morning, and we were at breakfast and split firewood for us. We sold our calf so we could buy firewood. It rained and thundered a little last night. Mrs. William Hume brought us a loaf of bread and some meat Wednesday evening, as we had neither in the house." So she's dealing with real poverty. Ultimately, she does get a respite, sadly. When her mother dies, she's left at loose ends. The family's rented house is given up. The furniture is stored at her brother's, and she goes and she laments that she may have to work in hotels, which seems to create horror for her brothers. She ultimately visits relatives back in Gwillimbury, north of Toronto, and she makes the acquaintance of a widowed farmer. Her brother suggests she must freeze onto him, and ultimately she marries and becomes a stepmother. And she wrote some letters. She seems to have found a degree of contentment in her later years, and seems to have been quite relatively happy. So her story, I suppose, turns out rather well. What I'd like to just quickly sum up is to suggest that the letters suggest that once a family ceased to be an economic and social unit, once they had moved and dispersed, the reality was that family ties persisted. They continued to carry on squabbles. There were personality conflicts that emerge in these letters, like siblings today. But there's a degree of affection, and particularly as they age, the economic component of the letters, once they're no longer having to care for their elderly parents, there's clearly a bond of an affection, and there's references to, I was so thrilled to get your letter, and many of the letters, of course, haven't survived, but the fact is that I got a letter from Billy, or Jaunty sent me a letter, was so thrilled to get this. And they're full of sadness, but there's a sense of maintaining ties. And as I said, in particular, Jaunty and Martha were the last two surviving, and he got to the point where he would send these self-addressed stamped envelopes, desperate for this connection and so forth. So individually, the letters may not say much, but collectively they can tell quite an interesting tale about family, connection, and all of those things that go with it.
Thank you, Greg. Almost feel like I'm part of the family now. All right, our next speaker is going to be Nicole Azelis from the Lambton County Archives. She's the archivist supervisor at that facility, which is located in Wyoming, Ontario. Nicole holds a degree in classical archaeology with a minor in ancient languages and a postgrad in museum and gallery studies. She's currently pursuing an executive master of business administration with a specialization in innovation leadership from the University of Fredericton. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, Dana. All right, so tonight I'll be diving into the diaries of Henry Jones Jr. This is part of the Jones family diary collection at the Lambton County Archives. Just to make sure you can see the diary screen, right? I can't see people, so I'm assuming we're good. So yeah, this collection contains diaries from 3 different Joneses, 2 diaries from Henry Jones Sr., the driving force behind the Maxwell settlement, once located in what's now Brights Grove area, a single diary from Julia Jones, who was Henry Jones's 14-year-old daughter at the time, and it details her journey from England to what's now Lambton County, and 34 diaries from Henry Jones Jr., who's Julia's brother. He was born in England in 1809, and he traveled to Canada with his family in 1830. Henry Jones Jr. documented an extensive portion of his life with diaries. Within his diaries, he kept regular diary entries from the early 1830s until 1843. Then the collection abruptly stops until 1852, when it picks up regularly again. It is possible that he quit writing for that period, or the diaries were lost over time. The last diary in the collection ends in June of 1883, and Henry died on May 5th, 1885. He's buried in Lakeview Cemetery. So what I find so fascinating about these diaries is the level of detail regarding the environment of Lambton County in the 1830s and notations of daily events that he did, such as timber chopping, sights on his walks, chores, and the complexities of traveling town to town over harsh terrain. His first diary, this is the first page, remarks on the zoology of the neighborhood of Maxwell. And he states the township of Sarnia, in which Maxwell is situated, is bounded on the south by deep woods, extending with little or no alteration to the River Thames, and then on the north by Lake Huron, on the east and northeast by the forest of the township of Plympton, and the Canada Company Huron Tract on the west by the river. The tract was very flat, containing a great variety of soil, and presents probably all the features common to this part of America, and hence offers a very favorable field for the study of its natural history. 5,000 acres were sandy plains, 30 wooded with oak or pine, 5,000 acres swamp covered with white cedar, birch, and thick brush wood, 2,000 acres of small lakes, 1,000 of marshy prairies, and the remainder deep woods. The sandy plains extend from the River St. Clair, and immediately in the rear of these are the swampy lands. To the south of the swamps are low, deep woods on more but wet soils. From the proximity of this part of Canada to the immense western lakes, the climate is supposed to be more temperate than that of the more eastern parts. However, the last 2 or 3 winters have been extremely severe. On this discussion of birds, he also notes birds and especially sightings of the rare Baltimore oriole. And by the way, I quote in another entry, by way of steamboat, a young eagle, whereof gray or bald specialty I could not tell. He also noted regular occurrences of bears in the area, including one that had hibernated in a tree on his property over the winter months. So, as I mentioned, swamps and wetlands were prevalent, and they certainly were and still are breeding grounds for mosquitoes. So agricultural lands were believed to have less, and Henry Jones notes on January 5th, 1833, the study of entomology of the wooded country is by no means an easy task. A great variety of insects such country requires years to collect. And though in some instances cultivation tends to diminish the number of species, as every settler with pleasure discovers in the case of mosquitoes. He then notes the climate in Canada is certainly by no means fitted for the existence of a large insect population, not so much from its regular season of severe cold as regular attack to which it is subject, an August frost by no means uncommon. On the subject of animals, later in 1834, he laments that the red squirrel was the most destructive visitor to their cornfields and is, and I quote, an active and courageous little animal and very noisy. He muses that even when the squirrel is chased by a dog up the tree, it will turn and watch its enemy before making a loud chatter sound, then running down to the dog, pivoting and running up another tree, an event that he noted would go and could go on for hours. Fires were also quite common entries in his diaries, and they were more difficult to handle than they are today. So in a passage dated May 17th, 1834, Henry writes, sleeping in the hayrick, rose from the pig's bed with much reluctance at 5, caught my mare with a good deal of trouble and rode her home. John and Paul, so John being his brother and Paul being his brother-in-law, followed in skiff breakfast, and about half hour after was alarmed by the cry of fire. Threw down the book I was reading, bracket the pirate, and ran up to Aunt Susan's room immediately. Fire, as I anticipated, was bursting out of the oven. Nothing to be done. The pump was close to the fire. In less than 3 minutes, however, the kitchen and stove was a heap of flames. Ran down immediately and succeeded in saving my papers and some clothes. Remained in the east wing for some time in hope of saving it, but no water to be obtained. Before I left, it was in flames. Obliged to send all hands to protect the barn. It was a black day. So since Henry was the Crown land agent for the Western District, it is important to note that newspapers across Upper and Lower Canada were essential to getting the word out about land offices and upcoming land sales in other districts. Almost every paper regularly listed information about the upcoming sales. For the Western District, sales were held by the land agent in Chatham after the land office was built there, starting on the first Tuesday in July, and was held on the first and third Tuesdays of each month until the first Tuesday in November, when other arrangements were made by the government. Prior to that, a lot of the correspondence with Henry went through Sandwich. So by 1837, a shift in land transactions had Henry Jones Jr. writing very openly and honestly when he noted, "Looking back on my proceedings during the last year and my prospects at present, I must acknowledge that the view is anything but pleasing. The land business is in a very unsettled state. Indeed, the chances are that my present employment cannot last much longer. A devil of an annoyance after wasting 3 or 4 years of my life in it. My consolation is that, though poorly, I have managed to maintain myself and have acquired habits of business and a certain quantity of experience and information which will doubtless, under any circumstances, be useful to me hereafter." Heading into his later diaries, when he started writing again in 1853, which is on the right, his diaries became very straightforward, mainly noting the weather, business dealings, and just general happenings. He notes his daily correspondences, patents, and on the left, there's one patent he was extremely excited about with all the exclamation marks. The gentleman engaged in 24 patents. And so he was quite thrilled about that. Needless to say, that was a fun find in the diary. And by 1875, his diaries take a more casual approach. Once again, he speaks very candidly about his daily accomplishments, including records of wildlife, especially the birds that he saw each day on his regular walks to the Perch Creek. He also makes a notation of his purchases, such as a barrel of salt for pickling or whiskey for consuming. And then I just pulled out a little excerpt from this page here, talking about the blue jays. There's lots of blue jays in his diaries that he noted throughout. So it's a rare opportunity to access diaries that document so regularly and carefully a notable period in the county history. The Jones diaries have been cleaned, inventoried, and stored in archival safe boxes and that are customized for each diary to ensure that these snapshots of the past remain protected under optimal conditions. Due to the fragility of these diaries, they are in the process of being digitized and are being made accessible through the Lambton County Archives website, which you can see here, the ones that are currently accessible. And that is all I have for my presentation. So thank you so much. And Dana, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Nicole. That's truly one of the crown gems of the archives collection. And it's so great that it's getting accessible online where people can read it for themselves. So thank you very much. Another dream, Samuel Smith. This is Tuesday the 28th. I'm not sure what month. I dreamed I was going home and had to cross a high stone wall. I climbed to the top of the wall, admired the beauty of the wall, then attempted to descend. Henry told me not to descend for there was a mortar made for the masons. I shifted a little and dreamed I fell in a barrel of soft lime and sunk up to my middle. I was very much vexed with myself for having been so careless when I descended. Then they left me to clean myself as I could. Our next speaker tonight is David McLean from the Forest Museum. David taught high school history for 31 years and is currently a volunteer at the Forest Museum and the Plimpton, Wyoming Museum. He holds an honors BA in history from Huron College and a Bachelor of Education from Althouse Teachers College. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Dana, and good evening to everyone. Before I dive in here, really enjoying hearing all the other presentations, and I've always found, even though sometimes letters and diaries and so on can have their tedious bits, generally it's one of the most engaging ways to learn about history is to hear directly from people who lived through those experiences. So really enjoying these. Now, one thing I'm going to say here is I may be able to make a connection with something that was in Fiona's presentation about the diary, which as soon as I heard mention of it there in her presentation, I thought, yeah, that sounds familiar. So I'll save that to the end here. My presentation has to do with some documents that are actually in my possession, not the museum's possession. They're in my possession here. I'll just do this set up here. These are the letters of the Reverend James Douglas. So for my presentation tonight, I'm going to share with you some letters that connect with the very early days of Forest. They've been handed down over the generations in my family. The letters were written by the Reverend James Douglas, the first Congregationalist minister of Forest, who once boarded here in town with my second great-grandparents, James and Catherine McLaren. The two letters date to 1864 and 1866, and I will get to their contents in a moment. First, a little context from them before we get to the context. I know the archivists amongst us here and preservers of history are noticing the Scotch tape on some of the documents that was put on there way before my time. But I'm trying to take good care of these letters now.
David,
So anyways,
I can't see your
sorry,
screen.
sorry.
I can't see your screen.
Oh, let me go back here. Let me go back here. I didn't hit the green button probably. You see it now?
No.
Oh. Yeah, trouble getting your there we go. Try this again. This might do it. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, David.
So get back up here. Okay, let's get past that. Here are the letters I was talking about. So you can see the bits of Scotch tape on there. Thanks, Dana, and everybody for your patience here. So anyways, so James McLaren, my mother's great-grandfather, was born in Perthshire, Scotland in 1829. In the 1850s, James emigrated to Ontario, or what was then known as Canada West, and found employment working as a laborer for the Grand Trunk Railway Company. After the completion of the GTR through these parts in 1859, James became a section foreman and settled in the newly established community of Forest. In 1861, he married Catherine Grant, a local school teacher who was born near Lobo in 1840. The McLaren's house in Forest was located at the northeast corner of Jefferson and Washington Streets. Their house is long gone, and the property is now White Park. To James and Catherine would be born 7 children, including my great-grandmother, Grace, who I pointed out here. So it was in the summer of 1864 that the McLarens took in Reverend James Douglas as a boarder. The Congregational Church in Forest, at which he served, was built in 1860 on the 62, the northwest corner of Clyde and Union Streets, where this house was later built. Now, the first of the letters I have to share was written on September 21st, 1864, not long after Reverend Douglas had arrived in Montreal to attend studies in that city at what was then known as McGill College. The letter begins with comments about the challenges of finding decent and affordable accommodations in Montreal. So it appears that there was a housing crisis in Canada way back then too. He complains that, quote, the lowest charge for board was $3.25 a week. And that picture just popped up there as McGill College back in the day. So he said the lowest charge for board was $3.25 a week, a little more expensive than in Toronto. Reverend Douglas, however, succeeded in finding a place to stay with, quote, a gentleman's family, sharing in all the good things they shared in themselves. Indeed, I just live here in something the same way as I lived with you last summer. The rest of the letter provides fascinating details about Montreal, then with a population of just over 90,000. My favorite part is when he tells of looking out over the city from atop Mount Royal. Last week, I ascended the mountain that looks down upon over Montreal, from which I had a bird's eye view of the whole city. From this high eminence, the spectator can look down upon the roofs of all the houses in the town. It looks to be a town of a prodigious size, intersected with short railways in almost every direction. Near the end of the letter, there is an indication by Reverend Douglas that before he left for Montreal, James and Catherine McLaren had tasked him with investigating whether there was a place where Catherine's 10-year-old brother, Alexander, could receive help. Alexander was born deaf and mute, and there would not have been the types of supports available to them that a family would have today. Reverend Douglas informed the McLarens that, unfortunately, he had been unsuccessful in finding a place for Alexander. He said, quote, "I've made inquiry since coming here about an institution for Alexander, but there's not such an institution here. I suppose there's only one government institution of the kind in the country, and that is in Toronto. So I will not likely have the happiness of seeing any of you here during the winter." Now the second, we just have the one photo that I'm aware of Alexander McLaren. This is when he's about 60 years old, sitting on a porch with the McLaren family here. So the second letter by Reverend Douglas was written in March of 1866, about a year and a half after the first one. In the interval, much had happened in his life. He was now married and living in Lanark, a little southwest of Ottawa. I suspect, though, based upon his comments at the outset of the letter, that Reverend Douglas had, upon completion of his stays at McGill, returned to our area and may have once again stayed with the McLarens. The reason I suspect this is because of comments he makes about having, before he met his wife, escaped the clutches of some young lady at Bosanquet Township. Quoting Douglas, quote, "My wife's name is Maggie Blythe," that's B-L-Y-T-H-E, Maggie Blythe. Her nature is as blithe as her name. I could hardly have got a person of more humility, of better common sense, with cleverer hands and a warmer heart. How kind high heaven has been in allowing me to pass blamelessly out of the grasp of that yellow-haired deceiving thing who courses along Bosanquet. What a worthless creature I have lost. What a precious treasure I have gained indeed. After some details about Maggie and her family, Reverend Douglas shares about the couple's honeymoon trip to Ottawa. He writes, "It is a handsome city and has the nicest, magnificent houses of any we have seen in the country. We had the pleasure of surveying the Parliament buildings outside and inside." And this would be the original Parliament buildings, of course, that burnt down during the First World War. "We had the pleasure of surveying, I read that right. The Chaudière Falls, one of the natural points of interest of Ottawa, had a wild and horrific appearance." Reverend Douglas concludes his letter, as in the previous one, with some loving thoughts for the McLarens. He also asks that they, quote, "give my kindest regards to Mr. McFadgen, Mr. Livingston, and Dr. Hutton. For those who know something about forest history, the McFadgens and Livingstons were very prominent families in the town's history, while Dr. Hutton was its first doctor." To wrap up here, I will share with you what became of the McLarens and Reverend James Douglas. Reverend Douglas would later move to the Canadian West, eventually settling with Maggie in Edmonton. Their eldest son, also named James, became an Alberta Member of Parliament and later a mayor of Edmonton. Maggie passed away in 1910, and James Douglas in 1924. James and Catherine McLaren, meanwhile, moved out of Forest in about 1870 to a farm on the north side of the 12th line of Plimpton, just very short distance from where I am right now. On the north side of the 12th line of Plimpton, now Douglas Road. Sometime after, they also acquired the property on the south side, which, if you know the area, there's a family now, Ken and Sandy Vanasse. That's the same property. So Catherine, and these are photos of the farm and the old homestead there from 1870. Catherine sadly passed away in 1881 from typhoid, just shy of her 41st birthday. James, shown here in the picture on the right, that's my great-grandmother, On the right side of the picture, Grace with her brother George and sister Tina. So James and his sons helped construct St. James Presbyterian Church in Forest. And here's a photo, one of my favorite photos of him. It shows him farming. It must have been near the end of his life. That's James on the left with his son Angus McLaren. Shortly after his passing in 1899, his children built a house on the property on the south side of the 12th line of Plimpton. And here's the house, and it was in that house that my mother was born and raised. And one more thing, here's a photo of a 150-year-old organ I possessed. And it was given by Alexander Grant, who I mentioned earlier, the younger brother of Catherine McLaren, and he gave it to his niece. She never married, and the organ was thus passed down to my great-grandmother, Grace, and eventually made its way to our house. Okay. And now, so thank you very much, but just I'm going to mention of, if I can back up here, still share my screen. So 1939, a meteorite fell at the back of the McLaren property. Fiona mentioned a meteorite from 1939. It was known as the Dresden meteorite. I don't know if it's the same one that Fiona, you referenced from the diary, but a chunk of it fell on the back of the McLaren farm. So that's a story we've known about in the family for a long time. So I don't know if there's a connection there or not. So anyways, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David. You have amazing family pictures. That's pretty cool. Our last presenter this evening is going to be Kaylin Shepley, who's the curator at Sombra Museum. David, could you stop sharing your screen? Kaylin's been in that position since 2017. Her educational background is in languages and history, and she's currently completing a program in museum studies. She has co-authored a children's book based on experiences at Sombra Museum. All right, and we are going to go a bit over time. I see it's 8:28, so thanks everyone.
My camera is also having a bit of an issue tonight, so can everyone see my screen? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So I am talking tonight about Sombra journals through time. Sombra Museum is fortunate enough to have several diaries in our collection, as well as memoirs. Many of the memoirs were written from the deathbed of the author and as a project to keep them occupied and to remember their younger life, and then put together by a daughter or a granddaughter of the original writer. In this case, I'll be presenting about the diary of Jenny Cruikshank Stover. This is her first person account. So, as many of you have already mentioned, diaries, journals, and personal memoirs left behind for family, friends, and sometimes in the hands of archives and museums are snapshots of the time in which their writer lived. And more than that, each person viewed the same moment or even an event from a different perspective, informed by their own lived experiences. So there can be many stories of the exact same moment. And often people don't share their true feelings publicly, so diaries are an intimate snapshot and a rare and valuable peek into a person's daily life. I'd also like to mention that in my research, I am partially using a summary of the diary of Jenny Cruikshank that was written by one of our summer students last year, so I'll be referring to her summary. So this is the original diary of Jenny. It's in a very fragile state, so we do not currently handle it like Nicole had mentioned. Ours is in a specially designed archival box and is away in storage to preserve it. Some of our volunteers have painstakingly transcribed it and has tried to keep as true to form as possible in punctuation, spelling, and quotation marks. They've occasionally added punctuation to make the ideas clearer, but for the most part, they have stayed very loyal to the original source. And then we also have Jenny's pen here. So I'll start by saying that learning about the past is difficult to do without some help from the people who lived through those times or their relatives.
So luckily here at Sombre Museum, we've been generously gifted many pieces of the past, as I've mentioned, with let us connect the dots to what life was like before our time. This diary of Jenny Cruikshank covers the years of 1880 to 1881, roughly. And she lived in Sombre during the 1880s and kept a lively recording of her daily life in town. Her grandson, William Harold Stover, kindly permitted the museum to study his grandmother's diary and transcribe it in order to preserve its extremely fragile original state. Jenny's diary is filled with youthful emotion as she recounts the day-to-day life in Sombre alongside her friends and companions, some of whom were historically important names in the town's history, or from historically important families. So to start, a little background about Jenny. She was born on September 27th, 1862 in Middlesex County. At the time she started writing these diaries, she was 18 years old. She was in love with William Wesley Stover, who was the captain of the Champion tugboat, a very prestigious tugboat on the Great Lakes, which is well known for holding the record for pulling, I believe it was seven or eight ships up the Detroit River at the same time. He was often away on the boat during this period, and Jenny constantly wrote about how much she missed him and how she longed for the days when he would come ashore to see her. Her first entry in the diary is evidence of the passion for her sailor boy, opening with, "Oh dear, Will went away on the Champion today. I do not know how I will survive." When he is away, she writes, "I wished by the new moon that I might see W when he came home. I hope to get my wish." Her happiest days were the ones in which Will had time off the boat, where they spent as much time as they could together. One night he gives her his ring to wear for a couple of days, and she is overjoyed. When he wasn't on shore, she and her friends would watch for the boat to pass by on the river, waving and calling to them with all of their hearts. Jenny and her sailor boy did eventually end up with their happy ending, and they got married in 1883 and had 2 children together, Frank and Harold. So frequently mentioned in her diaries is her best friend, Hattie Cornwell, whom we assume was her best friend, as she was nearly constantly hanging around with Hattie. Hattie went away a lot, and they consistently wrote lengthy letters to each other and stayed in close contact. She spent a lot of time hanging out with people from the neighborhood, and a lot of them are mentioned in the diaries. She speaks about going to the Beery house and having as many cherries as she could eat, giving piano lessons at the Stokes house to the children, and dancing the polka at the Burnhams' house. All 3 of these families are prevalent in Sombre's history. John Edgar Bury Jr. built his home in 1881, and today it's the location of Sombre Museum, set up to look as it did in that Victorian era. Many members of the Stokes family lived in Sombre, dating all the way back to its early years. Eventually, a Stokes will even live in the Bury house, married to the sister of John Edgar. William Stokes was a pioneer of the town, and Sarah Stokes was a well-known woman in town who was an entrepreneur and worked as a milliner, making hats for the townspeople. She also made clothing, and her homemade wedding dress was actually featured in the Canadian Textile Museum exhibit, and it is held permanently in Sombre Museum's collection. The Burnham family dates back to the earliest history of the town. Sombre was originally named Louisville after Louis Burnham, who had a store on the corner of Smith and Water Street, and also the first windmill in town. So an entry highlighting this time in Jenny's life and her mention of friends and hanging out in their day-to-day life. We have Saturday. It's unknown which month, but it's in early 1881. Up and breakfasted early. I went up to Bury's, had a lot of cherries. In fact, as many as I could eat. I saw Abby Deer's photograph, and oh, how my heart jumped. I tell you, but it was handsome. I came down on the Clark, had a reduction to a young man. He would have looked immense if he had shorter petticoats on or no overskirt. No word from W. And then later, I believe it's September 20th, 1881, several months after, judging by the position in the diary. This is her mention of Hattie, and it exposes a little bit of her friendship and what they got up to together. So Tuesday, September 20, 1881. Up early this morning, I went up to Whiteley's and pulled Hattie out of bed. I had such a time getting ready, and no more than just in time. Hattie and Emma went. Stanley cat and tagged Em all day. She would run away and leave him. Then Henry Stokes would call him and ask him to sit down and put him next to Em. She was so vexed. We saw such lots of colored people and what style they put on. We went out to the fairground to see the steam thresher that goes and makes no noise. We saw the Governor General, and that was something worthwhile looking for. We had a splendid supper, stewed oysters and pickles. I had an introduction to Sam Bullis. I saw Uncle Jimmy, Hattie Stover, cousins Violetta Lark, and Laura Rhodes. If Will had only been there, I would have enjoyed myself so much better. And to make matters worse, the boys were home this afternoon and saw no one but Uncle Peter. But they were no more disappointed than we were. I was with Henry Stokes all day, but he is not the style for me. Somehow I felt something like Emma did, I guess. Never mind. Winter's coming and a good time coming. So Jenny was also very musically gifted, and as she speaks often about singing in the church choir and teaching piano lessons to many people from the neighborhood. Indeed, she traded piano lessons, judging from some evidence in the Sombre Museum's archives. She traded piano lessons partially for board at what would become the Beery House. She originally lived in Strathroy, but she moved down to Sombre to teach music in the old schoolhouse. She taught children in the junior room, and when other teachers or the principal were sick, she took over their rooms and was mostly in charge. She wasn't a professional teacher. She simply taught the children what she had learned during her time in public school. Most nights she was at the church practicing with her friends for Sunday service. Her musical talent was felt all throughout the town, as in almost all of her entries she writes about who she gave a piano lesson to that day or about her day at school teaching. Before the world of technology and entertainment at your fingertips, Jenny and her friends found interesting ways to kill time and have fun. There were lots of dances. One of her friends would host a dance at their house, and many people from town would go and spend the nights learning new moves. On a cold day in December 1881, Jenny mentions going to the hall with her friends and dancing the polka, as well as a circle dance with Will. One night she goes taffy pulling with Will, and most of the young people of Sombre were there as well. Another thing they did for fun was going down to Smith's Dock and watching the boats on the St. Clair River. On one late summer night, she and her sister and the sister of the local cheesemaker, Mr. Brown, went down to the dock and watched the Hiawatha ship try to pull a vessel that had been stuck for days. Many moments were spent reading and practicing for a choir or hanging out with whoever was free in town. Speaking of reading, in the second last entry of her diary, dated Wednesday, November 30th, 1882. I prepared to sit around the stove all morning in dread of going out to Brown's, and just as I was enjoying myself in doing so, Mrs. Stover came in and said that Elisha was out on the road with his sleigh and wanted me to go out, which I did willingly, and Walter Brown brought me home with his horse and cutter. We went to the literary, and such another time. I had never in all my life experienced moving and then moving in opposition. Will gave Hat and I a piece of his tongue after we came home, and it did no good. So he went to the store to give D. Elder a tongue thrashing. So the literary was the earliest form of library in Sombre. It's a bit of an insight into the town, and the groups of young people would get together and obviously have quite heated debates about literature that they were reading. So the diary also offers an interesting glimpse into the 1880s and how different things were compared to now. Something that is mentioned a couple of times is the price of items, which seem incredibly inexpensive compared to today if you don't factor in the difference in the value of money. Jenny's family visited Detroit one afternoon and took the Star ferry over, and it cost nearly 40 cents to go across. Another entry mentions that an old store owned by Mr. Burns was up for sale in Sombre, and he said he would sell it for $8 a month. Nowadays, that's how much it would cost for a can of pop and a bag of chips in that store. Well, maybe if it's as cheap as $8. Nowadays, another drastically different thing in her diaries is transportation. Back in 1881, obviously there were no automobiles, and instead a horse and buggy was the main way to get from one place to the next. The roads were not paved, the sidewalks were made of wood, And indeed, in Sombra with our clay, if it was in any way wet, it was basically unpassable muck. Jenny recalls days when she took a horse and buggy to get to a lawn social or to go spend the day in Sarnia or Chatham. Another way that people got from place to place was by boat, and Jenny often rode across the river to go see her friends in Michigan, or she would take one of the Sombra ferries. Another way of transportation, people could often hop on ships such as the Tajmu, or one of the other exploration or island hopping boats, or even a steamer, and they could hop on in Sombra and then get off in Courtright or anywhere along the St. Clair River with very little fuss. Fashion and clothing were also very different in those times in the styles of clothes they wore as well as where the garments came from. Everything was made by hand, and there weren't department stores. Well, maybe Eaton's, but in Sombra, you would have to order from the catalog and wait weeks or months for your item to arrive. Many entries are filled with Jenny talking about sewing clothing for herself and others. She sewed herself a blue cloth dress, a pair of pants, mittens to keep her warm in the cold months, a dress for a doll, and an apron to wear at school. She even practiced sewing baby dresses for when she had children of her own. She and her mother went to 2 weddings in the winter of 1881, where the brides wore cream-colored dresses with white slippers instead of what we would find as a traditional white wedding dress and heels today. The white wedding dress hadn't quite caught on yet, as it was brought into style by Queen Victoria at her own wedding in the 1840s, and most people in town were wearing their Sunday best or a specially made dress in a darker color and of a material that was also easier to clean. Something unheard of today is that when Jenny and her friends went swimming at a nearby island, they wore their old dresses in the water, including their undergarments and stockings. And here I will read you the passage. So it is when, oh, sorry. Okay, so it is August 30th, Tuesday, 1881. Very, very warm. We had to quit teaching and go resting this afternoon. At 4, Hattie and Emma Whiteley took a boat and some old dresses and went down to their island, and we had a good time bathing. They mentioned the island, which would be Fawn Island. We were completely covered with burrs, every bit of our underclothes, even our stockings inside and out, but we felt ever so much better afterward. Along with most teenage lives, the diaries are chock full of drama. One of the first entries is about Mr. Stover's niece coming to Sombra while she was having trouble with her husband. She said she didn't want to go back home, even though she had 5 small children there. At an evening social, people from Lambton tied their horse to a fence, but someone cut the ropes and the horses escaped. There was also an exhibition at the church, and Jenny wouldn't perform at first because she felt like no one was appreciating all of the hard work she put in. Then one day at the train station, a man named Mr. McCarty came home from the insane asylum where he had been for the last 2 years, which apparently struck fear into Jenny's heart because he had not changed a bit. Perhaps the most intense part of the diary is the story of what happened to John Burnham. He went out hunting one day, and as he went to climb a fence with his gun, the gun caught on the fence and went off. It shot off 2 of his fingers, and another one of them had to be amputated because it wasn't salvageable. This left John with only his thumb and forefinger on his left hand, meaning he could no longer play the church piano. Jenny went to visit the Burnhams a few weeks later and discovered that although John was doing well, he had pickled his fingers and placed them in a jar for preservation. So here, to wrap up, I'll just mention also world events. As many of you have indicated, a diary can often have a brief glimpse into the local perspective on world events. And we have a final entry from Tuesday, September 29th, 1881. So this was a busy day for some, I guess, voting for the Scott Act. I saw 2 buggies go down the road at breakneck gallop this morning at 7:30. Doc was one of them. Mr. Knight was not very well today, but his wife came down on the Clark, and she's been away almost 3 weeks. I told him one was no good and that it wanted another to help it. He began to tease me about Doc and said a little too much about me turning cartwheels as soon as Will came to shore for good. And I told him I didn't care what he said, that Doc was as good as those who talked about him. And And then we'll skip to a note that was written in the margin after that. It says, Jenny later added a note at the top of Tuesday's page referring to the Scott Act. She says, the votes at this stand took 38 for whiskey and 33 against. So the Scott Act of 1881 allowed individual communities to vote whether they would allow liquor or if they wanted to become temperate. So obviously the people of Sombre, although somewhat closely divided, decided to choose their whiskey over temperance. And then finally, we have the story of Jenny, and it basically tapers off with your average day at the end of November. She talks about going to school and going to choir practice, and that is it. So if you read the diary fully through, you want to know, does Jenny marry Will? Does Hattie marry Mr. Burnham? There are all sorts of relationships and stories that we never really get an end to. So luckily we have archives at the museum, and we've been able to piece together all of the drama and the stories and the relationships and to find out who ended up with whom. And happily, Jenny does get her sailor boy. So her lover boy, as she also referred to him as. This is a photo of Jenny and Will in their later years. So in conclusion, we're very grateful for these donations that provide us with an inside look into how Sombre used to be. The gracious donation of Jenny's diaries has educated us on the ins and outs of daily life in town and how different things used to be versus how they are now. While her diary is only written through the span of 2 years, it provides a lot of beneficial information and keeps everyone reading and entertained. If you're interested to come and research about past relatives or people in town, or if you have anything you wish to donate, such as a diary, you can always visit the museum. So thank you, everyone. And finally, a shot of Jenny and her son, Frank, and Jenny and Will Stover's home, which rested in Sombre until 2010.
Awesome. Thank you, Kaylin.
You're welcome.
I will always remember that story about the pickled fingers. I see we've got a question here for Nicole. He had been interested in the Jones diaries and was wondering if there was a plan to digitize Malcolm Cameron's letters, which were acquired, he believes, a few years ago at Lambton County Archives.
So we are slowly working through digitization. There is a plan to work through some of the earlier letters, and we do have a pretty substantial collection of Clark letters, family letters as well, which is a very interesting look, especially at early Sarnia business. So yes, there is a plan to digitize the letters and diaries, and so we're working through it as we can. But certainly we're working with some of the most fragile materials first, and then we're moving on from there.
Thanks, Nicole. If anyone else has questions, feel free to throw it in the webinar chat or the Q&A. I'll let those come in. I'm going to give some updates from our local museums as well. Sorry, I know that we're over time. So from Forest Museum, tomorrow and Saturday, they are having an estate sale at 8651 Goose Marsh Line near Grand Bend. They've also launched an online silent auction of items that have been donated specifically for the auction. The auction and the estate sale details can be found on their website. Their annual general meeting is scheduled for May 15th at 7 p.m. at the museum. All are welcome. And the museum's opening day for the season is May 24th. They're also participating in Forest's annual townwide garage sale on May 25th. And on June 5th, they're hosting tea at the Carnegie. More details to come, but it sounds fun. From Moore Museum, they have their annual Victorian tea coming up May 19th. It'll be 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. You can order tea and scones served by Victorian costume servers in the charming atmosphere of their turn of the 20th century cottage. Play Victorian era games and explore the exhibits in the other 12 buildings that make up their heritage village. I am keeping an eye on the Q&A. If anyone does have any questions, I'm happy to take those in between the museum updates here. From Lambton Heritage Museum, we have an exhibit opening next week, May 15th. It's called Il Camino, From Italy to Sarnia Lambton. And we're going to explore the experiences of Italian immigrants to the Sarnia Lambton in the last 100 years. Some of the programming associated with this exhibit includes movies at the museum day on June 7th. We're presenting Luca, and there will be free popcorn, as well as a presentation on June 15th from Caroline de Coco about Ciociaria, which is a hidden gem in Italy that's full of travel opportunities. Our next feature exhibit after that is Hockey, which is a traveling exhibit from the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. It will also feature items that we've collected from members of the community documenting our local hockey story alongside the national story. It opens July 17th. So you can check out our website, heritagemuseum.ca, for details about our upcoming exhibits. And admission is free this year for Lambton residents to celebrate Lambton's 175th anniversary. So it's a great year to come and see us. From the Lambton County Archives, they are launching the show and tell events to celebrate the county's 175th anniversary. They'll be hosted at library branches all over the county, providing our community with the incredible opportunity to highlight their historical prized possessions, like photographs and artifacts. A team from the Lambton County Museums and Archives will be digitizing and photographing these items to preserve their stories for future generations. You can visit lambtonmuseums.ca/show for more information. Lots going on at the Oil Museum. Their Great War Weekend is coming up, May 25th and 26th. The Canadian Great War Society will be there in reenactment uniforms, demonstrating infantry drills and training exercises. And there's going to be horses. Cavalry demonstrations on horseback and a mock campsite are included. The event runs Saturday 11 to 4 and Sunday 11 to 3. They're also planning an event for the June 7th PA Day. They've partnered with Shell to teach kids about innovation and science in the petroleum industry. There'll be crafts, scavenger hunt, and real-life experts to chat with. They would like to thank Shell for sponsoring this event, so it's free for everyone to attend. Finally, for the Oil Museum, later this summer, the annual Black Gold Fest returns July 13th. It's a family-friendly free event with face painting, crafts, and activities. Trucking Mamas and Black Gold Brewery will be there, so there is truly something for everyone. And on August 10th, they'll be hosting Wells and Wheels, their first car show. You can go to oilmuseum.ca to learn more about what's going on there. And our update from Sombra Museum. They're open for their season June 1st to the end of September. Upcoming exhibits include 2 displays featuring the SS South American and the Miss Super Test, and a small exhibition of local art to celebrate Lambton's 175th anniversary. Upcoming events include Trivia Night on May 25th. Teams of 1 to 6 have to register by May 23rd to attend. You can do that by phone, email, or through direct messages on social media. Your cost is $10 per person. There will also be a summer trivia night that's going to be held on August 3rd. Their annual Blueberry Social is taking place July 6th. There'll be live entertainment, family activities, special guests, and of course, plenty of blueberry desserts. You can also meet them at Sombra Days on July 7th from 1 to 3 for a kids activity. You can follow at Sombra Museum on Facebook or Instagram, or find them on Google for more details. So our museums are very busy. There's so much going on. Hope that you can join us at some of these great activities throughout the summer as we kind of move into our busy seasons. So I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but I wanted to thank our presenters so much for sharing these interesting and intimate details from the lives of some of our Lambton County residents. And I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar tonight. So please, when you get the video link, if you want to share it with any family or friends, that would be wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night. Bye.